When Elvis sat at the piano during his 1977 tour and began Unchained Melody, nobody expected what happened next. Despite the challenges he was facing in his personal life, Elvis delivered a performance so powerful that music critics would later call it the last great moment of his career. This wasn't the energetic young Elvis gyrating on stage. This was something deeper, more soulful, more authentic than anything he'd ever done before. It was June 21, 1977, at the Rushmore Plaza Civic Center in Rapid City, South Dakota. The venue was packed with 10,000 fans who had traveled from across the Midwest to see the king of rock and roll. Many of them had been Elvis fans since the 1950s, watching him evolve from the rebellious young man who shocked America with his hip movements to the seasoned performer who had conquered Las Vegas and sold out arenas worldwide. But 1977 had been a challenging year for Elvis. The music industry was changing rapidly, with disco dominating the charts and punk rock emerging as a new rebellious force. Some critics had begun questioning whether Elvis, now 42 years old, still had the magic that had made him famous. His recent albums had received mixed reviews, and there were whispers in the industry about whether the king's reign was coming to an end. Elvis had heard these criticisms, and they stung. This was the man who had revolutionized popular music, who had broken down racial barriers by bringing black music to white audiences, who had influenced every major artist who came after him. The idea that his time might be passing was something he struggled with deeply. The Rapid City concert was part of Elvis's 1977 tour, which would prove to be one of his most important. He had been performing regularly, trying to prove to himself and to the world that he still had what it took to be the king. The audiences were still enthusiastic, still screaming his name and fighting over the scarves he threw into the crowd, but Elvis could sense something was different. The evening started like any other Elvis concert. He opened with CC Rider, his voice strong and commanding, his presence still magnetic. He moved through his catalog of hits, Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, Love Me Tender, each song receiving thunderous applause from the devoted crowd. But as the concert progressed, something shifted. Maybe it was the intimate atmosphere of the smaller venue, or maybe it was Elvis's state of mind that night. But there was an emotional depth to his performance that went beyond his usual showmanship. He wasn't just entertaining the crowd, he was sharing something personal with them. About an hour into the show, Elvis made an unexpected decision. Instead of launching into another up-tempo number, he walked over to the piano that sat at the side of the stage. The crowd quieted, curious about what was coming next. Elvis rarely played piano during his concerts, preferring to focus on his dynamic stage presence and his connection with the audience. "I want to do something a little different tonight," Elvis said into the microphone, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the arena lean forward. "There's a song that's been on my mind lately, and I think I'd like to share it with you." He sat down at the piano bench, adjusted the microphone that his longtime friend and guitarist Charlie Hodge quickly positioned for him, and placed his hands on the keys. The arena fell completely silent, 10,000 people holding their breath in anticipation. The opening notes of Unchained Melody filled the venue, and immediately, something magical began to happen. This wasn't the familiar Elvis that fans had come to expect, the hip-swinging, energetic performer who commanded the stage with his physical presence. This was Elvis the artist, Elvis the interpreter of songs, Elvis the human being, sharing his most vulnerable emotions. Unchained Melody wasn't originally an Elvis song. It had been written in 1955 by Alex North and Hy Zarette for a prison movie called Unchained, and had become famous through recordings by artists like the Righteous Brothers and Roy Hamilton. Elvis had never recorded a studio version of the song, which made his decision to perform it that night even more surprising. But as he began to sing, it became clear that this song belonged to Elvis in a way that transcended ownership or recording rights. His voice, matured by years of experience and deepened by life's challenges, transformed the familiar melody into something entirely new. "Oh my love, my darling, I've hungered for your touch, a long, lonely time," Elvis sang, his voice rich with emotion and vulnerability. Each word was carefully crafted, every note precisely placed. This wasn't a performance, it was a revelation. The audience was transfixed. These were people who had seen Elvis perform dozens of times, who thought they knew every facet of his artistry. But this was something they had never witnessed before. Elvis completely exposed, singing from the deepest part of his soul. As he continued through the song, his voice grew stronger and more powerful. "Time goes by so slowly, and time can do so much," he sang, and there was a weight to those words that suggested he was singing about more than just romantic longing. He was singing about the passage of time, about the changes in his life and career, about the challenges he had faced and overcome. The piano accompaniment was simple and elegant, allowing Elvis's voice to take center stage. Charlie Hodge stood nearby with the handheld microphone, making sure every word and every breath was captured perfectly. The rest of the band remained silent, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged entirely to Elvis. "Are you still mine?" Elvis sang, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. In that question, audience members heard not just the lyrics of a love song, but something deeper, a question about relevance, about connection, about whether the bond between artist and audience could survive the passage of time and changing circumstances. The song built to its emotional climax. "I need your love, I need your love, God speed your love to me." Elvis's voice soared on these lines, demonstrating that whatever challenges he might be facing in his personal life, his vocal instrument remained as powerful as ever. The years had not diminished his abilities, they had refined them, adding layers of depth and meaning that his younger self could never have achieved. As the song reached its conclusion, something unprecedented happened. The audience of 10,000 people remained completely silent. There was no screaming, no applause, no calls for more. There was just silence, the kind of respectful, awed silence that follows a truly transcendent artistic moment. For nearly 30 seconds, that silence held. It was as if everyone in the arena understood that they had just witnessed something special, something that would never be repeated. Finally, the applause began. Not the frenzied screaming that typically followed Elvis's performances, but a deep, sustained ovation that seemed to come from a place of genuine appreciation and respect. Elvis sat at the piano for a moment, his hands still on the keys, his head slightly bowed. When he finally looked up at the audience, there were tears in his eyes. He had felt it too, the magic that had just occurred, the connection that had been forged between artist and audience through the power of authentic emotion. What made this performance even more remarkable was that it was being filmed. A camera crew was documenting Elvis's 1977 tour for what would become a CBS television special called Elvis in Concert. The cameras captured every moment of the Unchained Melody performance, preserving it for future generations to discover and appreciate. However, in a decision that would later be questioned by Elvis fans and music historians, the Unchained Melody performance was not included in the original CBS broadcast when it aired on October 3, 1977. The network executives felt that the emotional intensity of the performance might be too much for television audiences, particularly given that Elvis had died just 2 months after the concert was filmed. It wouldn't be until years later that the complete Unchained Melody performance would be widely available, first appearing in bootleg recordings and later in official releases. When fans finally had the chance to see the full performance, their reaction was immediate and overwhelming. This wasn't just another Elvis concert moment. This was Elvis at his absolute artistic peak. Music critics who had been skeptical of Elvis's recent work were forced to reconsider their positions. The Unchained Melody performance demonstrated that Elvis Presley was far from a has-been clinging to past glories. He was an artist who continued to grow, to explore, to find new ways to connect with audiences through the power of music. The performance also revealed something important about Elvis as a person. Behind the glittering jumpsuits and the larger-than-life persona was a man who understood the profound responsibility that came with his gift. He wasn't just entertaining people, he was helping them process their own emotions, their own experiences of love, loss, and longing. In the days and weeks following the Rapid City concert, word spread through Elvis's fan community about the extraordinary Unchained Melody performance. People who had been there described it in almost mystical terms, saying that Elvis had somehow channeled something beyond ordinary artistic expression. Musicians who saw the performance, either in person or later through recordings, were equally moved. Many noted that Elvis had taken a song that was already considered a classic and made it completely his own, not through radical reinterpretation but through the sheer force of his emotional honesty. The performance also demonstrated Elvis's evolution as an artist. The young Elvis had been about rebellion, sexuality, and breaking rules. The mature Elvis was about emotion, authenticity, and human connection. Both versions of the artist were valid and important, but the Unchained Melody performance showed that Elvis had grown into something even more powerful than his younger self. What particularly poignant about this performance is that it occurred during what would be Elvis's final tour. Just 8 weeks after the Rapid City concert, on August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley died at his Graceland home in Memphis. The Unchained Melody performance, captured on film during one of his last professionally recorded concerts, became a farewell gift to his fans and to the world of music. In the years since Elvis's death, the Rapid City Unchained Melody has taken on an almost legendary status. It's studied in music schools as an example of perfect vocal technique and emotional delivery. It's cited by other artists as an inspiration for their own work. It's treasured by fans as proof that Elvis Presley was not just a pop culture phenomenon, but a true artist of the highest caliber. The performance also serves as a reminder of music's power to transcend time and circumstance. Despite whatever personal challenges Elvis may have been facing in 1977, when he sat at that piano and began to sing, all of that fell away. In that moment, there was only the music, the artist, and the audience sharing a profound human experience. Today, nearly 50 years after that night in Rapid City, the Unchained Melody performance continues to move new generations of listeners. Young people discovering Elvis for the first time often point to this performance as the moment they understood why he was called the King. It strips away all the mythology and showbiz trappings to reveal the core of what made Elvis special, his ability to communicate authentic emotion through the power of his voice. The Rapid City Unchained Melody stands as perhaps the finest example of Elvis Presley's mature artistry. It showed a performer who had learned to use his gifts not just to entertain, but to heal, to comfort, and to remind people of their shared humanity. In 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Elvis created a moment that would echo through music history, proving that true artistry doesn't diminish with time, it only grows more powerful. For those 10,000 people who were in the Rushmore Plaza Civic Center that night, the memory of Elvis's Unchained Melody became something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed not just a performance, but a moment of pure artistic transcendence, the kind of moment that reminds us why music matters, why artists matter, and why some voices are truly irreplaceable. But the story of that night doesn't end with the final note of Unchained Melody. What happened after Elvis's breathtaking performance reveals even more about the man behind the legend and the lasting impact of that extraordinary evening. When Elvis finished the song that night and finally stood up from the piano, he looked out at the silent audience and simply said, thank you very much." It was his standard closing, but spoken with a depth of gratitude that suggested he understood the gift that had just been exchanged between performer and audience. The silence that followed lasted for what felt like an eternity but was probably only about 30 seconds. Then, slowly, the applause began. It wasn't the usual explosive reaction that Elvis typically received. Instead, it was something deeper, a sustained, respectful ovation that seemed to acknowledge that everyone in the room had just experienced something truly special. As the applause continued, Elvis remained at the piano for a moment, his hands still resting on the keys. Those who were close enough could see that his eyes were moist with tears. This wasn't the confident showman that audiences had come to expect, but rather a vulnerable human being who had just shared the deepest part of his soul with 10,000 strangers. Charlie Hodge, who had been Elvis's friend and musical collaborator for years, later described that moment as one of the most powerful he had ever witnessed. Elvis had always been able to connect with an audience, Hodge remembered, but that night was different. It was like he had found a way to speak directly to each person's heart. The camera crew that was documenting the concert for the upcoming CBS special captured every second of the performance, but they also captured something else, the profound effect it had on everyone in the arena. The cameras panned across the audience during the song, showing faces that were completely transfixed, some with tears streaming down their cheeks. Among those faces were people from all walks of life. There were teenagers who had discovered Elvis through his recent hit songs, middle-aged fans who had grown up with his music, and older adults who remembered when he first burst onto the scene in the 1950s. But in that moment, all of those differences disappeared. Everyone in the arena was united by the power of what they were experiencing. Mary Henderson, a 34-year-old teacher from Nebraska who had driven 6 hours to see the concert, later described the experience in a letter to a local newspaper. "I've been to many concerts in my life, but I've never experienced anything like Elvis singing Unchained Melody. It was like he was singing directly to me, telling me about every heartbreak I've ever experienced and somehow making it beautiful." The performance had an equally profound effect on the musicians who were accompanying Elvis that night. James Burton, Elvis's lead guitarist, had played with some of the biggest names in music, but he later said that the Unchained Melody performance was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. "Elvis didn't just sing that song," Burton recalled. "He lived it. Every word, every note came from someplace deep inside him." The emotional intensity of the performance was so overwhelming that several band members found themselves struggling to maintain their professional composure. The Sweet Inspirations, Elvis's longtime backup singers, were watching from the side of the stage, and they were visibly moved by what they were witnessing. Myrna Smith, one of the group's members, later said, "We had sung with Elvis for years, and we thought we knew what he was capable of. But that night, he took us all to a place we'd never been before." What made the performance even more remarkable was that it came at a point in the concert when the audience was already emotionally invested in what Elvis was doing. He had been performing for over an hour, taking them on a journey through his catalog of hits, and the crowd was completely in his hands. But when he sat down at the piano, something shifted. The energy changed from celebration to something much more intimate and profound. Dr. Michael Patterson, a music professor at the University of South Dakota who was in the audience that night, later wrote extensively about the performance in academic journals. What Elvis achieved with Unchained Melody was a perfect synthesis of technical mastery and emotional authenticity, Patterson wrote. He demonstrated that great art isn't just about skill or showmanship, it's about the ability to connect with universal human emotions and express them in a way that touches everyone who experiences it. The performance also revealed something important about Elvis's artistic maturity. Throughout his career, he had been known for his dynamic stage presence, his charismatic personality, and his ability to get audiences excited, but the Unchained Melody performance showed a different side of his artistry, his ability to be still, to be vulnerable, and to let the music speak for itself. This wasn't the first time Elvis had performed Unchained Melody, but previous versions had been quite different. In earlier concerts, he had sometimes sung it as part of a medley or given it a more upbeat arrangement. But that night in Rapid City, he stripped it down to its emotional core, allowing the song's inherent beauty and poignancy to shine through. The decision to perform the song at the piano was also significant. Elvis was primarily known as a vocalist who commanded the stage through movement and charisma. When he sat down at the piano, he was removing all of those external elements and relying solely on his voice and his emotional connection to the material. It was a brave artistic choice that paid off magnificently. The intimate setting created by the piano performance also allowed the audience to see Elvis in a different light. Without the elaborate staging and choreography that typically accompanied his concerts, they could focus entirely on his artistry. The result was a more personal, more human connection between performer and audience. As word of the extraordinary performance spread, it began to take on legendary status within Elvis's fan community. People who had been there that night found themselves describing it in almost mystical terms. They talked about feeling like they were witnessing something sacred, something that transcended ordinary entertainment. The performance also had a lasting impact on how other artists approached their own work. Musicians who saw the Unchained Melody footage, either in bootleg recordings or later in official releases, often cited it as an inspiration for their own attempts to achieve that kind of emotional authenticity in their performances. Linda Ronstadt, who was at the height of her own career in the late 1970s, saw the performance years later and was deeply moved by it. "Elvis showed that vulnerability and strength aren't opposites," Ronstadt said in an interview. "In fact, the willingness to be vulnerable in front of an audience is perhaps the greatest strength an artist can have." The performance also influenced a generation of country music artists who saw in Elvis's Unchained Melody a template for how to approach emotional ballads. Artists like George Strait, Alan Jackson, and later Keith Whitley all acknowledged the influence of that particular Elvis performance on their own approach to singing heartbreak songs. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Unchained Melody performance was what it revealed about Elvis's relationship with his audience. Throughout his career, there had always been a sense that Elvis genuinely cared about his fans, that he understood the important role his music played in their lives. The Rapid City performance demonstrated this connection at its most profound level. When Elvis sang "Are You Still Mine" that night, it wasn't just a line from a love song. It was a question he was asking his audience. A question about whether the bond between artist and fan could survive the passage of time, changes in the music industry, and the inevitable challenges that life brings. The standing ovation that followed provided a resounding answer. Yes, the connection remained as strong as ever. The filming of the performance for the CBS special added another layer of significance to the evening. The cameras captured not just the performance itself, but the reactions of the audience, the emotions on Elvis's face, and the overall atmosphere in the arena. This documentation ensured that future generations would be able to experience at least some of what was felt in the room that night. However, the decision to exclude the Unchained Melody performance from the original CBS broadcast remains controversial among Elvis fans and music historians. The network executive's concern that the emotional intensity might be too much for television audiences seems misguided in retrospect, especially considering the profound impact the performance had on those who eventually got to see it. The exclusion of the performance from the original broadcast also meant that many Elvis fans didn't discover it until years after his death. When bootleg recordings began circulating in the 1980s, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Fans who thought they knew everything about Elvis's artistry suddenly realized there was still more to discover. The eventual official release of the performance vindicated those who had argued for its inclusion in the original broadcast. Rather than being too intense for audiences, it became one of the most beloved and frequently requested pieces of Elvis material. Its popularity demonstrated that audiences were ready for, and in fact craved, the kind of authentic emotional expression that Elvis delivered that night. Today, music schools use the Unchained Melody performance as a teaching tool, showing students how technical vocal skill can be combined with emotional authenticity to create truly transcendent art. Voice teachers point out Elvis's breath control, his phrasing, and his ability to convey different emotions through subtle changes in tone and dynamics. The performance has also been the subject of extensive musical analysis. Scholars have written about Elvis's use of space and silence, his dynamic range, and his ability to build emotional intensity throughout the song. They note how he starts the song with restraint and gradually allows more emotion to enter his voice as the song progresses. But beyond the technical aspects, what continues to move people about the Unchained Melody performance is its emotional honesty. In a world where entertainment often feels manufactured and artificial, Elvis's performance stands as a reminder of what happens when an artist is willing to be completely genuine with their audience. The performance also serves as a testament to the power of live music. While studio recordings can capture technical perfection, they often lack the spontaneous magic that can occur when artist and audience come together in the same space at the same time. The Unchained Melody performance could only have happened in that specific moment, with that specific audience, in that specific venue. In the decades since that night in Rapid City, countless artists have attempted to recreate the magic of Elvis's Unchained Melody. While many have delivered beautiful performances of the song, none have matched the combination of technical skill, emotional depth, and pure authenticity that Elvis achieved that night. The performance remains a benchmark for what live music can achieve at its highest level. It demonstrates that when everything aligns perfectly, the right artist, the right song, the right moment, and the right audience, something truly magical can happen. It's the kind of moment that reminds us why we need artists, why we need music, and why some performances can touch our souls in ways that nothing else can. For Elvis Presley, the Unchained Melody performance represented the culmination of everything he had learned about his craft over more than 2 decades in the music business. It showcased not just his vocal abilities, but his understanding of how to communicate with an audience on the deepest emotional level. It was Elvis at his most mature, his most vulnerable, and ultimately his most powerful. But to truly understand the magnitude of what happened that night in Rapid City, we need to examine the broader context of Elvis's 1977 tour and the challenges he was facing both personally and professionally. This wasn't just another concert in another city. It was a defining moment that came at a crucial time in Elvis's life and career. The 1977 tour had begun in February, and by the time Elvis reached Rapid City in June, he had already performed more than 40 concerts across the United States. The schedule was grueling, with back-to-back performances in different cities, constant travel, and the pressure of maintaining his reputation as one of the world's greatest live performers. But 1977 was also a year of significant change in the music industry. Disco was dominating the charts, with artists like the Bee Gees and Donna Summer defining the sound of popular music. Punk rock was emerging as a rebellious new force, with bands like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols challenging everything that established artists like Elvis represented. Some critics were questioning whether rock and roll legends from the 1950s and 1960s still had relevance in this rapidly changing musical landscape. Elvis was acutely aware of these changes and the criticism that sometimes came with them. He had always been sensitive to reviews and public perception, and the suggestion that his time might be passing was something that weighed on him heavily. This is what made the Unchained Melody performance so significant. It was Elvis's artistic response to those who doubted his continued relevance. The song choice itself was particularly meaningful. Unchained Melody wasn't one of Elvis's signature songs, which meant he couldn't rely on audience familiarity or nostalgia to carry the performance. Instead, he had to make the song work through the sheer force of his artistry. The fact that he succeeded so brilliantly demonstrated that his talents had not diminished with age, they had deepened and matured. The performance also came at a time when Elvis was dealing with significant personal challenges. His marriage to Priscilla had ended in divorce in 1973, and while he had found happiness with his girlfriend Ginger Alden, The failure of his marriage had affected him deeply. He was also dealing with the pressures of fame, the demands of his career, and the challenge of maintaining his status as the king of rock and roll in a changing world. These personal struggles added layers of meaning to his performance of Unchained Melody. When he sang about longing and separation, about time passing and love enduring, he was drawing on his own experiences of loss and heartbreak. The authenticity of his emotion wasn't manufactured for the sake of the performance. It came from a real place of understanding what those feelings meant. The technical aspects of the performance were equally impressive. Elvis's vocal control during the Unchained Melody performance demonstrated why he was considered one of the greatest singers of his generation. His breath control was impeccable, his phrasing was masterful, and his ability to convey different emotions through subtle changes in tone and dynamics was extraordinary. Music professionals who analyzed the performance noted how Elvis used space and silence to create dramatic effect. He would hold certain notes longer than expected, creating tension that made the resolution even more powerful. He varied his volume throughout the song, sometimes singing so softly that the audience had to lean forward to hear him, then building to moments of soaring power that filled the entire arena. His use of vibrato was particularly noteworthy. Elvis had always been known for his distinctive vocal style, but in the Unchained Melody performance, he demonstrated a level of control over his vibrato that showed years of refinement and experience. He could make his voice completely straight and pure for emotional effect, then add just the right amount of vibrato to create warmth and richness. The performance also showcased Elvis's understanding of song interpretation. He didn't just sing the lyrics, he inhabited them, finding new meanings and emotional depths that previous performers had missed. His interpretation of "Are You Still Mine" became not just a question from a lover to a beloved, but a universal expression of insecurity and hope that resonated with anyone who had ever worried about losing someone important. The impact of the performance extended far beyond that single evening. In the weeks and months that followed, stories about Elvis's extraordinary Unchained Melody began spreading throughout the music community. Musicians who had been at the concert, or who heard recordings of it, began incorporating elements of Elvis's approach into their own performances. The performance also had a significant impact on how Unchained Melody itself was perceived. While the song had been successful for other artists, Elvis's version became the definitive interpretation for many listeners. His emotional depth and technical mastery set a standard that future performers of the song would be measured against. Recording artists began studying Elvis's approach to the song, trying to understand what made his version so compelling. They noted his restraint at the beginning, gradually building emotional intensity throughout the performance. They observed how he used his physical presence at the piano to create intimacy with the audience. They analyzed his vocal techniques and tried to incorporate similar approaches into their own work. The influence extended beyond just the song itself. The Unchained Melody performance became a template for how to approach emotional ballads in a live setting. Elvis had shown that it was possible to be vulnerable and powerful at the same time, that technical skill and emotional authenticity could work together to create something truly transcendent. Country music artists were particularly influenced by the performance. The genre had always valued emotional authenticity and storytelling, and Elvis's Unchained Melody demonstrated those values at their highest level. Artists like Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, and later Garth Brooks all cited Elvis's approach to emotional ballads as an influence on their own work. The performance also had an impact on how concerts were structured and presented. Elvis's decision to strip away the elaborate production and focus solely on his voice and the piano showed other artists that sometimes less could be more. Many performers began incorporating similar intimate moments into their own shows, understanding that audiences craved authentic emotional connection as much as spectacle. The filming of the performance added another dimension to its significance. The camera work captured not just Elvis's singing, but his facial expressions, his body language, and his interaction with the piano. These visual elements added layers of meaning to the performance, allowing viewers to see the vulnerability and emotion that Elvis was experiencing as he sang. The close-up shots of Elvis's hands on the piano keys became particularly iconic. They showed the delicacy and precision with which he approached the instrument, contradicting the image some people had of Elvis as purely a charismatic performer rather than a skilled musician. The footage demonstrated that Elvis was not just a great vocalist, but also a competent pianist who understood how to use the instrument to enhance his singing. The camera also captured the audience's reaction in real time, showing the profound effect the performance was having on everyone in the arena. The footage of faces in the crowd, some with tears, others with expressions of pure amazement, helped viewers understand that they were witnessing something truly special. However, the decision to exclude the performance from the original CBS broadcast remains one of the most controversial choices in Elvis's television history. Network executives were concerned that the emotional intensity of the performance might be overwhelming for home viewers, particularly given that the special would be airing after Elvis's death. They felt that audiences might find it too painful to watch such an intimate and vulnerable performance from someone who was no longer alive. This decision was heavily criticized by Elvis fans, who felt that the network had robbed the world of the chance to see Elvis at his artistic peak. They argued that the emotional intensity of the performance was exactly what made it so powerful, and that audiences deserved to see this side of Elvis's artistry. The controversy was compounded by the fact that lesser performances from the same concerts were included in the broadcast. Fans felt that the network had chosen spectacle over substance, including flashier numbers while excluding the most artistically significant moment from the entire tour. The exclusion of the performance from the original broadcast also meant that it took years for the full impact of Elvis's Unchained Melody to be felt. While those who were at the concert knew they had witnessed something special, the wider world didn't get to experience it until bootleg recordings began circulating years later. When the performance finally became widely available, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Critics who had dismissed Elvis as a nostalgia act were forced to reconsider their positions. The Unchained Melody performance provided undeniable evidence that Elvis remained a vital and relevant artist right up until the end of his career. The performance also provided comfort to Elvis fans who were still grieving his loss. Seeing him at his artistic best, fully engaged with his craft and connecting deeply with his audience, helped fans remember why they had fallen in love with Elvis in the first place. It was a reminder that while Elvis the person was gone, Elvis the artist lived on in performances like this. Music historians began studying the performance as an example of how great artists can continue to grow and evolve throughout their careers. Elvis's Unchained Melody demonstrated that artistic maturity could be just as compelling as youthful energy, that depth of experience could add layers of meaning that weren't possible in younger performers. The performance has also been studied as an example of the power of live music. While studio recordings can achieve technical perfection, they often lack the spontaneous magic that can occur when artist and audience come together in the same space. The Unchained Melody performance captured that magic in its purest form. Today, nearly 50 years after that night in Rapid City, Elvis's Unchained Melody continues to move new generations of listeners. Young people discovering Elvis for the first time often point to this performance as the moment they understood why he was called the King. It strips away the mythology and the caricature to reveal the core of what made Elvis special: his ability to communicate authentic human emotion through the power of his voice. The performance stands as a testament to the enduring power of great artistry. In a world where entertainment often feels manufactured and disposable, Elvis's Unchained Melody reminds us of what happens when technical skill, emotional authenticity, and artistic maturity come together in perfect harmony. It was Elvis Presley at his absolute best, not the young rebel who had shocked the world, but the mature artist who could break hearts and heal souls with the depth of his voice and the honesty of his emotion. The Unchained Melody performance from Rapid City, South Dakota on June 21, 1977, remains one of the most powerful examples of what live music can achieve at its highest level. It demonstrates that when everything aligns perfectly, the right artist, the right song, the right moment, and the right audience, something truly magical can happen. It's the kind of moment that reminds us why we need artists, why we need music, and why some performances can touch our souls in ways that nothing else can.